Hello, I'm John Barnes, and these are my readings for the pandemic topic. When I discovered this was the topic that I was supposed to be doing fiction readings from, or excerpts from novels, or whatever you want to call it, I thought about it and realized that, oddly enough, pandemics, or at least plagues or whatever, figured in two of my most disparate works, and they serve very different purposes in them. And I just thought it'd be kind of cool to juxtapose two very different ways of handling plagues. So probably the way to put this is that I'm going to read the plague part of the book from my most notorious work first, Kaleidoscope Century, and then I'm going to read from the one that seems to have the most intense, loving fan following, which is One for the Morning Glory. One is science fiction, very hard science fiction, actually, in most ways, and the other one is very loose fairy tale type fantasy. And I guess what they do, or what the plague does in each story, is very different, but that exercise can be left to the listener. So, Kaleidoscope Century. The narrator is Josh Aliquari. He's a very, very unpleasant man. He is, at the time that he's telling this part of the story, estranged very bitterly from his family, specifically from his father. He's serving in the American military. He is actually a Soviet spy, and what he's doing mostly is stealing stealth technology. And he's been controlled for a long time by or his handler, KGB handler, has been a guy named Harris. And, well, that's probably enough to get us somewhere into the situation. The frame story of the whole thing was that Josh wakes up on Mars shortly after 2100. He's about 140 years old, and the reason that this can be happening to him, though he was born in 1968, should become clear from the story here. So, let's go. I had just gotten the dishwasher going and the vacuum out when someone knocked. Harris, with a man who didn't look like anyone. I opened the door wide for them, and the nondescript man turned to Harris and said, "This is him, right?" "Right." "Go wait in the car." Harris left without saying goodbye, or even hello. I never saw him again. The nondescript man turned back to me, came in, closed the door, and said, "You've got a pretty comfortable life. It's time to start earning it." I nodded. "You need a drink or coffee or anything?" "No, thank you. I've got a lot of ground to cover today. Let me just fill you in, tell you what's going on, and then go. Feel free to ask questions about any parts you don't understand, of course." "Of course." He gestured for me to sit on my couch, and then sat beside me and opened his briefcase. As you know, things got unsuitable for the organization during the last year. Large parts of our infrastructure had to be sacrificed, not just because our assets were in the USSR and were seized by the new provisional government, but also because, for security reasons, we had to cut our traceable connections. But the procedure is complete. We no longer have significant overlap with the party, state, or army. In fact, we're no longer even in Moscow. You might say we're doing what Bush wants us to. We're privatizing and moving into being a purely capitalist enterprise. We have a number of clients interested in stealth, and our penetration is good enough to assure us you will be on one of the detection projects soon. When you are, you will begin to receive brief communiques, mostly questions, in a brown manila envelope that will be on the upper shelf of your kitchen cabinet. Check that shelf once a day after your promotion comes through. Give me your apartment key for a moment." I did. He took it off the key ring, dropped it into a box, and pushed a button. A loud beep. He handed me the key back without a sound, and I returned it to its ring. I didn't appreciate them coming in without asking, but I had decided long ago to let them have as much of me as they wanted. After all, I had no gripe about the pay. When you find a list of questions, write out the answers in handwriting and put that in the envelope along with the list itself. Make no copies of anything. Do not ever use a typewriter or word processor of any kind for this. Answer the questions by the indicated date, but don't compromise yourself to do it. If there's something you can't find out or don't know by that date, include a note to that effect. That's it for that part of the work. Any questions? You'll get a copy of the same instructions in every envelope. "No questions," I said, and got up to show him to the door, but he caught my wrist. "There's one other thing," he said, and pulled out something that looked like a ray gun from a cheap sci-fi movie. He saw how startled I looked. I think he smiled. "It's an air injector," he said. "You're getting a vaccination. Give me your arm." Figuring that these people could arrange for me to have a life sentence or maybe a lethal injection whenever they wanted, I didn't give him a fight. Not even an argument. I wonder about that. If I had, would he have said, "Fine, die of mutades"? Probably not, since CDC had not named mutades yet, and besides, that wasn't the organization's term for it. For that matter, I don't know whether anyone was calling it the organization officially yet. I think they dropped the term KGB since that stood for Committee for State Security, and the organization was no longer a committee, there was no longer any such state, and it wasn't interested in anybody's security. Probably I didn't think at all. I just stuck out my arm. He pushed the injector against my bare skin, not roughly, but firmly enough to make sure he had contact. The little gadget made a poofing sound. My arm stung for an instant. Done just like that. "What's it a vaccination against?" I asked. "Three things," he said. His inflection was flat. He spoke fast, like he'd said this a lot of times before. "You won't believe me at first. But because you had that shot, you will never come down with AIDS, though within a few months you'll begin to test HIV positive. Don't worry, it won't kill your job with the Secure Project. One of your old girlfriends has gotten infected recently, and it will be assumed that that's where you got it. But don't worry. You couldn't get AIDS now if you tried, nor can you transmit it." I nodded. "Thank you. At least I could be careless when I felt like it or when the woman wanted to be." "Secondly, it's a memory enhancer. You will find for the next several years that you don't forget anything. You'll remember every word you read or hear exactly, and everything you see exactly as it is. You'll still have to study to learn new things, because you have to be able to use the information as well as recall it, but you won't have to memorize anything ever again. As a side benefit, you'll be able to learn languages very rapidly." "You said for several years, then I'll need a booster?" He shook his head. "No, that's the third effect, which is caused by the same stuff that improves your memory. Some years from now, we don't know exactly when, you're going to come down with a bad fever, muscle aches, nausea, the worst case of flu you've ever had. It will last a few months. At the end of that time, your body will have done a fairly complete renewal of itself. You'll have dropped several years in biological age. But you will also have lost most of the memories from the years since the injection. That process will repeat indefinitely. Live 15 years with perfect memory, drop 10, lose all recent memory. So make sure this time and every time you keep good records of everything important in your personal life all the time." He got up to go. "Good luck. Welcome to active duty. Your pay will triple. We're seeing what we can do about the 18 months when we didn't pay you." I thanked him because it made as much sense as anything and asked, "Where did you get all these things?" "Which things?" "In the injector." He shrugged. They don't tell me much more than they tell you. My guess would be that it's the results of some of our special research and development work, and we probably got most of that out of the USSR before the Rising. It's not at all perfect, obviously. Life extension and memory enhancement is great, but the side effects aren't desirable for our purposes, let alone for yours. If things had gone better, I'm sure we wouldn't be trying it yet. He closed his briefcase, got up, and left. A couple days later, I noticed a squib in a newspaper about an unidentified body found in a parking lot. Money still in his wallet. The description matched Harris. But I wasn't about to call the morgue and offer to come in and identify him, and maybe I'm remembering a dream about something I was afraid happened. Oh, after all, Harris was a small fish. For the rest of it, there's the history books. First reports of a rapidly acting airborne mutant HIV, December 1993. Riots and panics all over. South Central LA blew up. Then on January 28, 1994, President Bush was found dead in bed. He had been ill for about 3 weeks before and probably contagious since July. There's a principle that most people are only about 6 contacts away from anyone else in the world, and it's true, but the reason is that few people are more than 3 contacts away from their national leaders. Think about it. Chances are you know some local politician. Who knows some national politician? Who knows the national leader? And all the national leaders know each other. My guess is that the organization targeted Bush. Having that on the WERP, if they're still around, ought to draw some attention. Why I want their attention, I have no idea. Except that 15 years from now, I'll be back in this position again. What if I just as soon die? Who would be better at killing me than the organization? Morbid thought, but that advertisement could be the organization. I have enough memories, and the WERP has dragged up enough fragments to convince me that they're probably still around. Anyway, when Bush died of mute AIDS, since most of the U.S. was only a few contacts away from him, it meant everyone was infected. From babies to grandmothers, everywhere. Every schoolchild now learns 3 things about it. Fatalities were concentrated in those over 40 years old. Mute AIDS confers permanent immunity to AIDS, which is why nowadays they give it to newborn infants deliberately. And in 1994, the year of the die-off, planet Earth lost 10% of its citizens between February and August. All that's in the books. Took a while to get leave. I had not expected how easy it would be to drive across the country, but then most of the people who did things connected with highways were young enough to survive. Only the major cities had had to use mass graves, and the only places that had really collapsed were ones with a lot of people past 40, Rust Belt cities like Pittsburgh and Detroit, Sun Belt places like Miami and Phoenix. For the rest, a couple of backhoe operators and a few people who had already gotten over the disease could toss the bodies in, so that if a town of 20,000 lost 2,000 people in 200 days, they only had to dig 10 extra holes per day. You could even keep the graves marked and allow people to hold graveside services if they wanted them. I made good time, and when I got to my hometown, sure enough, Gwenny, Daddy, and Mama were already gone. I might have figured it would be that way. I walked over that river bridge one more time, and something gleaming in the stream caught my eye. It seemed like a vivid, accurate memory, just possibly a Boy Scout knife. Just possibly I climbed down the bank, stripped to my waist, and dove for it, bringing that knife up like a trophy only to get chewed out by a policeman. As I stood there in the hot July sun, shivering with the cold of the river. Just possibly, I saw a scout knife in a shop, had a fit of sentimentality, and bought it. For that matter, maybe I just needed a penknife and bought a Boy Scout knife without thinking, not even in that town, but a year or 2 later. I can't trust my memory. I don't know about the matchbook either. Maybe I went into Gwenny's, found the diner under new ownership, and picked up an old matchbook because they were trying to get rid of them. Maybe I had carried one of those matchbooks for all of the 10 years since I left. Maybe I left a flower on Mama's grave. But several documents on the WERP say I dreamed that later, a recurring dream that wouldn't leave me alone for weeks and months. Of course, you can dream a memory as easily as remember a dream. I'm pretty sure I didn't creep into the emergency burial ground at night, find the right numbered marker, pull down my pants, and take a crap on my father's grave. A huge, wet, sour smelling one that left my butt smeared with shit despite my best efforts with the paper towel I'd brought. Till I could get back to the hotel and clean it off in the shower. Pretty sure I didn't. It's the 5th day. I've got all kinds of crap recorded. But when I read it or play it back, it doesn't seem to be what I intended it to be, and I already have a sense that I was at least dimly aware of lying when I was doing it. I changed the truth. Sometimes I maybe made something up to fill in a gap and forgot to say that was what I was doing. Sometimes I left something embarrassing out. I don't know. It's already getting hard to keep straight, and I've only been awake for less than a week. I guess now I don't blame myself for the mess that was in my work when I woke up, and I sure as hell wish I had been able to write as well as Sadi could talk or something, because I look and I find it took me a whole afternoon to write. Then the man came out from the KGB with Harris, and he said go back to the car, so Harris did. He told me about the AIDS vaccination and the memories and the long life, and then he left. I don't remember what he looked like. I don't think I ever remembered. I don't think there was much to remember. Later I heard Harris was dead, and I kind of wondered. And then the story shows up 3 more times, different each time that I talked it into the warp, and it's not any better in any of those versions. I can already see where in 15 years there'll be another mess to get through, but I don't know how to do it any better. All right, so that was Kaleidoscope Century. This, by the way, is the British edition, which is the best of all the published editions, has the fewest errors. The first printing was such a mess that Tor actually put a recall on it. Please do look for it, and if at all possible, get either the second printing from Tor, either of the hardcover or the paperback, or get that British edition. And you want thousands of copies. Okay, now over to one for the Morning Glory. This one has an oddly cult following. Sometimes I think it's just because Charlie Vest put such a great cover on it. Now, this is the story of Prince Amatus and various other figures in a place called the Kingdom. It has no more specific name than that because it's, as most people would figure out eventually, I think it's the Kingdom of Literature that we're visiting here. And anyway, let's just start with the Twisted Man is the captain of the guard and is Amatus's bodyguard, and there is something highly magical about him. He arrived after one half of Amatus disappeared. Specifically, his left half is simply not there. That doesn't mean it's invisible, it means it's just not there. I have no idea how he rides a horse or continues to live or anything else. And I didn't care when I was writing it either. So here we go. The Twisted Man and Amatus have been practicing because Amatus had been in a period of deep depression, and so he's been kind of doing weapons practice and generally getting himself ready to be a heroic prince again after being long out of shape. And they've been working out on a cold, wintry morning, and they're just finishing here. The Twisted Man spoke. Someone is coming up the trail behind us. Prince Amatus lowered the pismire he had just discharged, and his hand went about the business of wiping out the barrel, brushing the burnt primer from the tip of the bronze chutney, and checking the lovelock. In a moment, a small boy, dressed in rags but reasonably well fed, came around the bend on the trail. "Yes," the prince said. "Please, sir, my mother." "Grandma says a prince's touch sometimes heals when the illness is when it's an enigma," Amatus said, pulling a thin triolet from his pack and sliding it on over his wet clothing. "Indeed, that's a very old saying, and so likely true." Let me come with you at once." The hut was comfortable enough, as commoner huts go, for King Boniface and his father and grandsire before him had been enlightened enough to make sure the commoners were comfortable, if not stylish. There was at least a wooden floor up off the damp ground and a fire in the hearth, and the hut smelled of breakfast bread and broth. But the woman who lay on the pallet, tended by her worried old mother, was pale and drawn, and her face was looked older than it was. The grandmother stared at the twisted man, but after all, she knew a moment later who this must be, and suppressed her shudder at him. The captain of the guard bowed gravely to her, and Amatus threw back the quilted hood of his triolet and said, "Madam, I am sorry to be here on such an errand. Do you know anything other than that my touch will help? Is there some way in which I should touch?" "The saying says nothing of that," the grandmother said. "She seems hurt to the heart and in the blood." Amatus knelt beside her. He saw the woman's eyes grow wide as she realized who this half-youth must be, and reached out to calm her. Since her pallor looked like fever to him, he did without thinking what Psyche had done when she had been younger and ill, and put his hand on her forehead. What he felt in his palm felt like a shock from scraping across a carpet, but it felt in his arm like a hard yank on his shoulder, and it felt in his stomach like the first surge that says one has eaten something truly wrong. And in his heart, it felt like a cold rain on the day in November when you think of a lost love. He jerked back, feeling ill. The woman sat up, breathing easily, obviously very tired and just as obviously recovered. Amatus staggered to his feet, barely managing to acknowledge the grandmother's low curtsy or the boy's deep, awed bow. He nodded to them, and with the little part of his mind that was not whirling, he realized that they would not expect him to be with them another moment, for, after all, a prince surely must have better things to be about than this. That meant he could just say something and go. "Be well," he said, his voice sounding like the croak of a dying toad in his own ears, and walked from the hut, trying to make sure that his detached left foot kept pace with, and stayed parallel to, his right. The twisted man at his heels caught him as soon as they rounded the turn on the trail and were no longer visible. Prince Amatus had held himself together that long, but that had been almost worse than the original shock, for it seemed to drain his strength even more to pretend to be well. When the thick, strong arms of the twisted man wrapped around him, he slipped from consciousness for a few long moments before waking up being carried to the horses. "You can set me down. I think I can walk." "Are you sure?" The deep, cavernous rumble had as much concern in it as Amatus had ever heard. "Let's try." Once set upon his feet, he felt merely tired, and not much more so than might be accounted for by the morning's exercise thus far. "Let's see if I can do more shooting with the pismire, and after that, perhaps I'll even feel up to some wrestling or some work with the treble clef. I don't understand, but whatever the sickness is, it seems to have passed through me quickly." "If you are sure," the twisted man said, "but at the first sign of illness again, you are going home slung over the saddle." "I will not throw away your life or health as a point of pride." "Agreed, and neither will I, but I feel fine now." An hour later, tired and sore, he had some of his old aim and precision with the pismire back, and they had fought several best-of-3 bouts with the treble clef on an icy log. Amatus had not won, but he at least had felt he had given the twisted man something to contend with. As they rode back to the castle and made the last turn onto the road up the hill, they came upon a group of commoners waiting patiently by the roadside. The twisted man looked at the prince, and Amatus knew that it was in the captain's mind that they should just ride on past, but he also knew that he was a prince. So he swung down out of his saddle and approached them. The twisted man dismounted and followed. "Please, Highness," one of them said, "if you could, that is, I'd not ask, but my wife has gotten so much worse in the past hour and seems unable to bear the daylight. Do all of you have sick relatives? Amatus asked. All with the same illness I've already seen this morning? Silently, the crowd nodded as one. Well, Amatus said, sighing and thinking of how ill he had felt after one healing. The Twisted Man said, if we are seeing 10 sick here, there must be 1,000 and some fresh corpses in the city. You cannot heal everyone. I can do what I can, Amatus said, though I am afraid you are right. I think we know now what the wail was about, though I have no idea what has brought this curse on us. He turned back to the little band of anxious commoners and saw that hope was dying on their faces, for they had not thought of what the Twisted Man was pointing out, and now they were ashamed to have asked. He made himself smile at them grimly. There are, 9 altogether? Then I shall do it. But you will have to make me a stretcher and bear me to each hut after the first, for I am weak and ill after I heal. He looked up again at the Twisted Man. Go, get me soldiers from the castle to bring me home after this is done. I will be safe enough with these good people. The Twisted Man managed, despite his distorted form, to bow in a way that at once told Prince Amatus that the captain would obey, that the prince's gesture was noble and worthy of him, and that all the same as his guard, the Twisted Man wished to protest this. Then he mounted and left at a gallop. It was worse than Amatus had imagined, for he had given them instructions that after the first touch he was to be carried to each of the victims and his hand placed on their foreheads, since he had no idea as yet whether it would work with him unconscious. This turned out to be a moot question. For each time his stomach, heart, and soul lurched at the sick shock coming up through his arm and shoulder, it brought him back to consciousness for a long, unpleasant moment, so that the next hour for Amatus was comprised mainly of waking to the brutal jolt, looking into the eyes of a man, woman, or child whose face was slipping into peaceful, healthy sleep. Then the illness would wash over him, and he would sink back into a dark and bloody dream, to wake again from another jolt with a foul taste in his mouth and a squeezing heave in his stomach. He knew there had been more than 9, because they had asked him, and he had managed to rouse himself and tell them to keep him at it until the soldiers from the castle came. But it was not until he woke on a horse litter, on his way back to the castle, that he learned from Trooper Roderick, who was walking alongside, that he had healed 27 of them. Highness, you can't continue in this way, Roderick said, and the Twisted Man growled in agreement. Somehow the castle itself has thus far been spared, but there was word of 100 cases in town just below the castle. No fresh cases since dawn, but no one who has it now looks to live till sunset. Is it all over the city? No, not so far, Highness. It is a miracle that the castle is spared, for all the cases are close to it. Roderick's face tensed, and then he visibly relaxed as he looked away. Roderick, Amatus said softly, so that no one else would hear, your house is just outside the castle wall. Is Gwyn taken ill? Reluctantly, Roderick nodded. Then I shall heal her, the prince said, even if my strength will not bear more, but I am feeling much better. He sat up carefully and then brought his feet under him, and finally, with a light bound, he was on the road and walking beside them. As right as ever, well, except for not having a left side, but that was hardly unusual anymore. You recovered almost instantly from just one, and it took you less than an hour to recover from 28 healings, the Twisted Man pointed out. Perhaps I spoke in haste. If you wish to try it, you could probably heal the remaining 100 cases or so. Then I will do it, Amatus said, but while I feel healthy and strong, will you race me on foot to the castle? We have the morning exercise to finish. He had said it and then done it before he knew it would buck up the morale of Roderick and the other troopers. But the moment that he found himself pelting up the road, the Twisted Man beside him, cold air searing into his lungs, and the sun beginning to break through the gray lid of snow clouds setting the colors of the evergreens and the red-berried holly off around him. Amatus realized he loved this, felt how acutely he enjoyed it. It seemed as if his heart was swelling against the walls of his chest, as if he were saying goodbye to all of this. Just at this moment, and only just now seeing it for the first time, as they thundered side by side through the main gate in the East Batu, he found himself almost laughing. The 100 cases, well, 104, according to Cedric's chronicle, of the plague, whatever it might be, took him a good part of the morning, and then he slept through most of the afternoon in dark and terrible dreams of being pursued by he knew not what in the twisting and crooked alleys of he knew not where. He had awoken, feeling fine in the afternoon, and in the evening he and Cedric had spent a couple of hours looking through the ancient chronicles of the kingdom without finding anything much like the current plague in it. Indeed, the main thing they discovered was that the chronicles were in a sorry state, which Cedric quietly vowed to put right if he ever got the time, though that may have to await my retirement. When Amatus went to bed, a small part of his heart hoped against all reason that the plague would turn out to be a matter of a single day, that the plague itself might turn out to be the omen rather than the disaster. No one was dead yet, and he had managed to get every afflicted person as far as he knew. But the next morning, after the running and the practice with Isgries and Pismires, just as before, there was a long line of supplicants, and the morning passed in the endless, sick, horrible jolts as he was carried from one sickbed to another. Psyche went along with him this time, but there was little she could do for him. Mortis had sent brief word up from the dungeons that though she had no idea what might cure the plague, parts of her lore indicated that above all else, the prince, though more than old enough for it, would have to avoid the wine of the gods. This was unfortunate, for it had only just occurred to him that something that made him feel warmer and happier might well be the very stuff needed to speed his recovery after the cures were effected. As Cedric noted, the pattern this time was more pronounced and obvious. The plague did not venture back into any house where the prince had worked a cure. And thus, on the whole, the visited houses this time were a trifle further away from the castle, which was again spared completely. Cedric did not like the way that people were already beginning to mutter about the evident focus of the infection. It was as if a great finger had descended from the sky, pointed directly at the castle. In the afternoon, the exhausted prince slept in his chambers, and Cedric privately visited with Sir John Slitgizzard and Duke Wassant, finding both, as always, helpful and loyal, and more than ready to go out as escort for the prince on the following day. There were 132 cases, 28 in the village and 104 in the city yesterday, Cedric said. Today, there were 178 total, 14 in the village, 164 in the city. If we are correct that it does not return to a house where a cure has happened, then there should be no more than 2 cases in the village tomorrow, but there will be many more in the city. Sir John, who was not good at mathematics, nodded slowly, just as if he had been paying attention. And there are many thousands of houses in the city, so we cannot hope that things will work out as they have in the village? Very little hope of that, Cedric said. We shall just have to find a cure, or a way to ride it out, or anything that does not involve the heir to the throne becoming dreadfully ill for longer and longer parts of each day. But what I have summoned you for is slightly different nature. I want to know what is being said in the city, and though I have a dozen sources for what the aristocrats are saying, and a dozen more for the burghers, and yet a dozen more for the ordinary working folk, and even some sources among the Hectarians and the Bulgarians, what I do not have is anyone who can tell me what the city as a whole sounds like, for few people roam it from top to bottom, except you gentlemen, and the Lady Calliope. But she has shut herself in. Rumor has it she has decided that Amatus has broken her heart, and so I cannot ask her. Will you go out in the city tonight and learn what is said everywhere, and come back with what you learn? For it is truly not the plague I dread so much as the way that people are taking it, and the way the fingers are pointing. Sir John Slitgizzard leaned back in his chair and nodded grimly. I can tell you a bit right now, for I was about last night. It is what you have been dreading, I'm afraid. Many people, noticing that our prince has only recently begun to reform from a harsh and bitter existence and from hideous dissipations, believe he has brought a curse down upon the royal house, and that this is how it is being visited upon them. Wasson looked up from where he had been cleaning his fingernails with his pongi, pursed his thick lips, and added, and I've heard much the same. 2 loud-talking rebels who seem to be in league with some foreign power, and I guess I should say with Waldo the usurper, were busily spreading such ideas for a good part of last evening, until they met with dreadful accidents in alleys. My thanks, Cedric said, and quietly passed a bag of gold flavins to the Duke. And I can assume, as always, the accident seems to have been a violent quarrel between the 2 of them, with both fatally stabbed, the Duke said, sheathing his pongi. But it is easy enough to control those who talk in that way, because they are in the pay of a foreign power. Far more difficult, and not at all desirable, to shut up those who are loyal but merely worried. Cedric thought for a long time, and his hand began to stroke his beard, which he had a certain residual longing to chew. He was on the brink of saying something when the noise from the courtyard brought him up short. It was a great deal more than a mere low rumble, but not as much as a clamor. It was mostly voices. Cedric and the 2 nobles rushed into the corridor, and from there to one of the galleries overlooking the public courtyard. The scene below was confused, for such devices as banners and picket signs were as yet unknown, so the sides had not marked themselves out, and besides, one side had not arrived for this purpose. It was only the vegetable sellers, codwallopers, and cheesemakers who were allowed to use the courtyard in front of the Clerihew, having inherited that right from generations of vendors, were as deeply loyal a gang of royalists as might be found anywhere, and so when the loose mob of malcontents had arrived, they had immediately assailed them. Nor were the malcontents any better organized. There was one faction of them which had been stirred up by Waldo's agents. There was another which was made up of various people who sincerely wanted to ask the prince or king for help, not being sure whether or not the royal family had concerned itself in the process yet. There were some drunkards and ruffians who joined any passing crowd, mainly in hopes of picking pockets, or that matters might turn into a celebration that would allow everyone's bill to be footed. Somewhere in the middle there were 5 passionate Republicans, none of whom agreed with each other about anything except that it was the monarchy's fault. By the time Cedric arrived on the balcony, those with complaints had gotten thoroughly intermingled with the stallholders, hangers-on, and shoppers. An occasional punch was being thrown. Many more people were trying to make peace between their immediate neighbors, and everyone was convinced that everyone else needed an immediate explanation. The situation was not exactly a melee, not yet quite a riot, but it was well beyond a hubbub and rapidly moving toward being an uproar. King Boniface was out of the castle, fortunately, having gone fishing for the day at Cedric's strong urging, for he knew full well that things like this were apt to happen and that the king's nerves were on edge, so he had wanted to get him out of the way before any trouble might begin. Amatus, naturally, was sleeping off the effect of the morning's healing, and the first thought in Cedric's mind was this assemblage of louts might wake him. He was not the only person with that thought, for opposite where he stood from the Clerihew doors, Psyche and the Twisted Man burst forth. It appeared that their plan was that Psyche would ask for quiet and calm, and the twisted man would make sure that she got it. But the confusion was far too great for most of the crowd to notice them, and the twisted man, thank the gods, was refraining from real violence. Cedric cleared his throat and attempted to address the crowd, but further away than Psyche or the twisted man, he had even less success. Sir John Slitgizzard quietly drew up his mire and gestured to Cedric, indicating that he could discharge it into the air to get their attention. Reluctantly, Cedric indicated he should put it away, for some of the crowd might be armed and the shot might lead to bloodshed. The mob rumbled and stirred like a jellyfish pulling back from a splinter. They all turned to face the gallery directly under Cedric. Someone was descending from the gallery. From the way the twisted man, Psyche at his heels, rushed toward that side of the courtyard, Cedric judged it could only be Amatus. He descended the stairs and stood in an open space before the silenced crowd. The twisted man and Psyche flanked him, and a moment later Roderick and a dozen burly troopers had lined up behind them, creating an appearance of public order. As Cedric well knew, the beginning of actually restoring it. Well, I think that's far enough there, and as you might guess, the prince is going to make a bunch of promises, because those of you who know this book know that it is made up largely of literary references, so he's going to make a vow rather like that of King Oedipus. It's going to turn out rather better than it did the vow of King Oedipus. And I think that's probably more than enough there. So we've done a bit of realistic, it's alternate history now. A bit of realistic alternate history, and a bit of myth, and that's Kaleidoscope Century, and that's one for the Morning Glory. And I hope you will go to the dealers and procure dozens of copies, because it's the perfect book to fill your basement with. And again, I'm John Barnes, and I've really enjoyed talking to you all. Thank you.